The CEO of Telegram, Pavel Durov, held by French police. The detention of the Russian-born billionaire has been condemned by Moscow and Elon Musk. So why is he being detained? Does the case have wider implications for social media? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. He's one of the world's richest men, making his fortune from social media channels he's invented, including Telegram, which has nearly 1 billion users. But Russian-born French citizen Pavel Durov is now under investigation in France, arrested after flying in from Azerbaijan on a private jet. His encrypted Telegram app trades on its secrecy, refusing access to state agencies, to its databases or user information. There's a degree of secrecy so far about the French investigation too, but press reports in Paris suggest it's linked to allegations of criminal activity where Telegram was used. The company denies any wrongdoing, while the arrest has been criticized in Moscow and by Elon Musk. So why is Durov being questioned? What are the wider implications of this case? We'll be discussing all of this in a moment with our guests, but first, this report from Wilson Dysart.
Telegram's founder, Pavel Durov, was arrested at an airport near Paris on Saturday night. He was detained on an arrest warrant, but French prosecutors and Telegram have not commented on why. French media reports say prosecutors are examining allegations the messaging app Telegram has been used to facilitate the trade of drugs, weapons, and the exploitation of children. Telegram posted on its official channel saying it was absurd to hold the platform's owner responsible for the abuse committed by the users of that platform. Durov's native Russia in April urged Telegram to crack down on content it described as linked to terrorism, after an attack by gunmen on a Moscow concert theater in March that killed at least 145 people. But on Monday, Russian officials described Durov's arrest as an example of Western hypocrisy.
The arrest of Pavel Durov means that there is no freedom of speech, that the freedom of speech in Europe is dead. Elon Musk is free, Mark Zuckerberg is free, but Pavel Durov is now in prison. Why? Because he's Russian. He's a Russian by nationality and he's Russian by his citizenship. So he has been traced as a person to be a scapegoat for the West as an evil Russian.
Durov founded Telegram after widespread anti-government protests in Russia in 2011. And he has been living in exile since Russian authorities demanded he allow them access to the app in 2018. He refused. The platform has amassed nearly 1 billion global users, one of the world's most popular social media platforms. Elon Musk, who owns X, formerly known as Twitter, posted a message in support of Durov in the hours after his arrest, using the French word for liberty. Regulation of social media is under great scrutiny, with lack of moderation blamed for the spread of misinformation and enabling criminal activity. Durov's case will be watched with interest, not least by his competitors. Wilson Dysart, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guest now in Berlin, Ben Aris, founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews. He's been following this story very closely. And in Newcastle in the UK, Chris Stokel-Walker, a technology and digital culture journalist who also hosts the podcast Techtonic for the human rights organization Article 19. The organization looks at freedom of expression online with a focus on the human impact of big tech and social media. A warm welcome to both of you. If I could start with Ben. So let's start, first of all, Ben, with what do we know officially so far? We know he's been detained. He hasn't been charged. Have authorities spoken or announced about what they're questioning him over, what he's suspected of?
Very little so far. The French police have been quite reticent. They have said that he's been detained in connection with a preliminary investigation, and it's also been reported that he's being investigated by the cyber unit of the gendarmerie, and they've suggested it's connected to distribution of pornography and drug trafficking and terrorism. However, as you said, the charges have not actually been formally announced. His detention has just been extended for another 48 hours, after which they have to either charge him or let him go. But we're waiting for an announcement today. We're expecting to hear the details of the charges. And that will be key, because it can be everything from just obstructing justice, not cooperating in the investigation, through to being linked, complicit or an accessory to the crimes that are allegedly going on Telegram. And those charges, if it comes to that one, then he faces significant time in jail and a very large fine.
This is quite a significant development, is it not, Chris? Do we have any indication about just how solid this move is, the case against him might be?
As Ben says, Sami, we are at a very, very early stages of this, and from what we understand, the details are incredibly sketchy. We have had earlier today the Secretary General of the OFMIN, which is the Office of Minors in France, talking about how Durov was arrested over the course of kind of a lack of moderation and a lack of cooperation with authorities when they're trying to tackle crimes against children. So that would suggest that this is perhaps something to do with the images that were being shared of potential child abuse, and also potentially you can think of things like maybe child trafficking. A lot of the lure of Telegram, I suppose, is this option, and it is an option. One of the main misconceptions of how Telegram works is that everything is sent by default through an encrypted process, but it's actually something you have to actively turn on. But you can do that, and if you have an encrypted messaging service, then suddenly you can imagine that this might be useful for criminals to try and coordinate some of their crimes, and also to kind of communicate with one another. So it looks like that is the case, but as Ben has very clearly laid out, we're still in the very early stages of this. We still don't fully know what exactly Durov is alleged to have done, and until we find that out, I think it's going to be very difficult, not just for those of us talking about it, but also for Durov himself to be able to mount a defense.
Ben, what do you make of the timing of this? Because Telegram has been talking about how its user base is growing, how it hopes to be profitable soon. There was even talk about maybe heading towards an IPO.
It has to IPO. It tried to raise. Telegram itself makes no money. It's been existing on Durov himself, who is, you could call him the Zuckerberg of Russia, in so much as his previous company, the Contacted, now known as VK, is basically the same as Facebook, and he was forced out of that. He had to sell it several years ago, but made a lot of money, and he's been funding Telegram. Then he floated a coin called the Gram, and was hoping to monetize it by that. And he has investors, and he's been issuing bonds, and he's promised to pay the investors back by March of 2026. And in order to do that, the plan is to do an IPO. Otherwise, it becomes unclear how he's going to continue to pay his investors. He has to spend something like $100 million a year on servicing the bonds that he already has. However, if he's still in jail, then the IPO becomes problematic. But certainly it's on the cards.
Chris, the possibility of people using apps for criminal activity probably can't be only related to Telegram, right? One imagines a lot of apps and platforms can be used potentially for criminal activity. Why is Durov and Telegram being targeted in this way?
There are a couple of reasons, I think, why, Sami. You rightly point out that Telegram is not the only app that will host crimes and the communication of crimes and the organization of crimes through its services. I think what makes Telegram slightly different, and what makes Pavel Durov perhaps an easier target for French authorities to take what is frankly unprecedented action, I think, in terms of bringing a tech CEO to heel here and alleging significant concerns around them, is that both Telegram operates in this kind of very odd grey area where, in part because of Durov's very outspoken defensive free speech and his willingness to kind of defend the rights of users against law enforcement requests, which Telegram makes a great deal of. It says, blatantly that it will try and refuse as many of those requests as possible because it believes in freedom of speech. And with that, Durov shares an awful lot of space and beliefs, I think, with the likes of Elon Musk. That makes it a target because that makes it a place where you are likely to see more criminals and others who are trying to evade detection starting to kind of congregate. Now, doesn't mean that this is a hotbed of crime. Many people use this simply for communicating with friends and family, and Telegram has made that very clear that they believe that this is a case potentially without merit here. But I think
hang on, Chris. We do know. Just sorry to jump in, but we do know, of course, there have been allegations against other apps that they have been used by potentially criminal activities, extreme far-right individuals and groups, some of whom have been accused of engaging in violence or even convicted of engaging in violence. The recent riots in the UK highlighted that issue with allegations that they'd used Twitter. And yet we haven't heard of any attempt to go after the owner or the CEO of some of those platforms, right?
Which gets me onto the point that I was just going to say, which is that Telegram operates in this kind of odd space where it is a big platform, 900 to 950 million users, depending on how you're counting. And Pavel Durov is a very rich man, anywhere between $9 and $15 billion net worth by some estimates. But he is not in the sort of same stratosphere as the likes of Elon Musk or the likes of Mark Zuckerberg. And likewise, although Telegram is a lifeline for many people, good and evil, it's also nowhere near as big or as important as many of those larger apps. And so I think that there is an element here of Pavel Durov and Telegram being kind of a medium-sized fish in a big pond, and therefore
Chris, are you saying he's basically
target.
an easier target?
Yeah, that's exactly what I just said. He's an easier target than anybody else to try and target here. Because if you try and bring Mark Zuckerberg into handcuffs as he steps off a plane in Paris, I imagine that there would be a whole host of lawyers coming against the French authorities there, and also a very, very strong media presence to try and defend that. Whereas Pavel Durov is a degree smaller, and I think that is playing into the French authorities' hands here.
You've been following this case, Ben, and the growth of Telegram and its founder's story for a long time. Listening to what Chris is saying there about him being an easier target, tell us a little bit about what message that's sending in light of the fact that we do have credible allegations by credible organizations like the 2022 report by Amnesty International that pointed the finger at Facebook's algorithms and, as it put it, relentless pursuit of profit as contributing to human rights violations in Myanmar. And yet we haven't seen the same level of targeting, shall we say, of others as we're seeing that's going on with Telegram.
Indeed, I think that targeting Facebook, it's such a huge global enterprise that it's a sexy thing to go after. And if you're going to make that kind of allegations against social media, then you start with the biggest ones. But to follow up on the point that my colleague was just making, what makes Telegram really special in this case is the lack of moderation. In Telegram's case, it's really extreme. Durov's whole philosophy is do not interfere at all. And you can frame that as a freedom of speech thing, and the Russian deputy you showed before was doing exactly that. But he's really adamant, he's quite obsessed with it, that he doesn't interfere with what people say or do. He won't let anybody into the system to have a look at the messages, to the point where he faced off with the FSB in Russia, the former KGB, the successors of KGB, who demanded the electronic keys because they too were doing a terrorist investigation. And I think it's quite clear, because of the encryption, because of the secrecy that you can have in sending your messages, this is an obvious platform for criminal actors to use. And even in those cases that Telegram has not cooperated with the authorities, they've done it on very rare occasions. They were pressured by the Americans and did close down some terrorist chat groups that were using Telegram. And again, the same charges come up here, that one of the parts of the investigation has been made clear is that French authorities are investigating some sort of terrorist network. And again, Durov has refused to give them access. And under the new digital
So hang on, Ben, listening to you there,
is
is he being pursued because the lack of moderation, or because he simply refuses to hand over the electronic keys? Because, coming back to the example I gave of the Amnesty International report, what they said about Facebook was not simply that there was a lack of moderation. They said the way that the algorithms were structured and set up, and the profit-pursuing policies actually meant that Facebook was playing a much more proactive role in the spread of hate speech. Now, surely that is a bigger issue than simply being passive if you're looking at applying law and order equally, right?
Both are true, but it's slightly different. In the case of Facebook, you're posting messages to be read by the general public. In the case of Telegram, these terrorist groups, criminal groups, are having private chat groups, private messages, and that doesn't go to the public. And the point is that they're attracted to Telegram because not only do they have that end-to-end encryption if they turn the secret messaging function on, but there's also, because there's no moderation, there's no one looking over your shoulder to see what you're writing about. Whereas in the case of X and Facebook, I mean, if you post a video or a picture of violence, and the Facebook people will take it down. And that's the point, is that Telegram does not interfere at all with anything that you post. And also under the new law, that if you are moderating your chat groups and you suspect them of criminal activity, you're obliged to report it to the police. And again, Telegram hasn't done that. It doesn't report anything. I mean, it just leaves them alone. And that's the attraction of it. And that's why it's grown so fast. And when I'm talking to friends in Russia, the leading app in Russia is WhatsApp, ironically. However, if they want to talk about business or we're discussing details of a story, then they always ask me to switch to Telegram. There's this trust, particularly in Eastern Europe, that what you say on Telegram won't go any further and can't be spied on, whereas the other apps can be.
On that point, though, Chris, I mean, if it's a matter of moderation and there's no one looking over your shoulder, I mean, there have been cases where the finger has been pointed at Twitter, to take another app, during the recent rioting in the UK, where some of the things which Ben was talking about, the obligation to step in and intervene and end any activity that's seen as inciting breaking crimes, there have been accusations that there's been failures there by some of the other apps like Twitter, with the former Twitter vice president for Europe, Bruce Daisley, calling for an arrest warrant for Elon Musk if he, quote, continues to stir up unrest, right? But yet we're not seeing, is there not, what we're hearing in the social media sphere, at least in this part of the world, in the Southern Hemisphere, is there is a perception of double standards here.
Yeah, well, I think it's less double standards. I think it's more a degree of difference, Sami. So as Ben highlighted, Telegram's unique selling point is essentially that it is, if not outright marketing itself towards criminals, it is providing services and a way of doing things that is at least useful to criminals. Whereas on Twitter, X now, you have a kind of a slightly more pared back version of that, where you have some moderation, although it has become much, much worse since Elon Musk's takeover. And that is in part because of his kind of dogmatic approach to free speech, and also in part because of what seems to be his political persuasion. And then you have on the other end of things, WhatsApp, Facebook, and the other platforms that are run by Meta, which no one is denying that criminal activity happens on those, but it's kind of as an adjunct to, rather than a reason for that platform existing. So some people might say it's double standards.
Is it really perceived as that? Is that really the case, though, Chris, when you look at some of the recent statements by Elon Musk during the riots in the UK and the way that was interpreted, the country heading towards civil war and so on? And that caused a backlash even from the Prime Minister of the UK.
Yeah, but that's Elon Musk being a professional troll. It's no surprise that Elon Musk has inserted himself into the Pavel Durov case, not least because he shares a lot of things politically and societally in terms of his beliefs.
But a lot of people, Chris, interpreted that as supportive of the idea, at least, of continuing to allow a platform for the expression of a lot of right-wing opinion that many considered or wondered whether was a violation of hate speech laws and crimes.
Yeah, and I personally believe that it is, and that is Elon Musk's world that we choose to live in. He has unfortunately bought this app and decided that he is going to take it in that direction. Notably, however, it is interesting that X under Elon Musk has actually acceded to pretty much every government request that's been asked of it to hand over data. And we did see with Telegram, not necessarily handing over data to government, but I know certainly I was reporting on some of the groups that were being used to organise the riots in the UK in the last few weeks over the summer, and suddenly they started disappearing. And we learned later through Telegram's press office that they were deciding to actually take action against this. So I think there are degrees of difference here. Pavel Durov does recognise that there are some things that are potentially beyond the pale, not least when police are starting to breathe down his neck a little bit. But it is interesting here that yes, Telegram is, I think, a degree of difference away from the other slightly more mainstream platforms. Perhaps that's the best way of thinking of it, is mainstream platforms versus fringe platforms. And no one is denying that Telegram's near billion users are not significant. But I think that if you ask the average person to list a number of messaging services or social media platforms off the top of their head, Telegram probably comes way down near the bottom.
Listening to what Chris said there. Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the point. I mean, in many ways, this Durov case could be a test case, a landmark case, in so much as it's catalyzed, or better to say, crystallized this whole issue about the need for companies to moderate their content and to pay attention to what's going on. And you've mentioned the riots in the UK, and in this case, we've got Telegram facilitating drug traffickers. And we have this new European digital law. But until this point, the social media companies have been left largely self-regulate themselves and put in their own standards for moderation of what they find acceptable and what they don't. Someone like Musk has got his own biases, and so they put some funny rules in there, and things like the Ukraine has been downgraded in the search, which is a quirk of his. But I think with
is this a turning point, Ben? Do you think more regulation may be coming, more government involvement may be coming?
I think it's crystallizing the debate around it. I mean, here we are having exactly the discussion. And that, one of the options here is that the French could accuse Durov of being an accomplice to these crimes, not just like hosting them, not just, failing to cooperate with the law enforcement investigation, but actually being an accomplice. And if that happens, then he goes to jail for a long time. And it means that, I'm sitting here in Germany, and if I wrote some tweet praising Hitler, which is illegal in Germany, then not only will I get punished, but then it makes Musk also complicit in that and open to criminal charges. So this could, I don't think it's going to go that way. But the point is that what is the responsibility of the owner of the social media to moderate? What are the guidelines? Where are the standards?
Precisely.
And in the print press and TV,
Absolutely.
That's very well.
I'm glad you raised that point, because I'm fairly sure, Ben, you're not going to tweet something supportive of Hitler. But beyond that, where does the responsibility for how people use an app or a product end, Chris? Telegram says it's completely absurd to hold the owner responsible for how people use a messaging or social media app.
Same arguments made by gun manufacturers and others, isn't it? That they can't be responsible for the actions of the people who own them. I do think that there is a responsibility here, and I do think that we are at an interesting moment, because this is the first time that essentially European regulators have not just talked the talk, but have walked the walk. And it is interesting that they have decided to go after an individual, a named person, rather than a company. So Ben mentioned earlier two of the large European bits of regulation that are coming through, the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. They serve different purposes, but essentially the design of them is so that European consumers, whether you are buying stuff or you are interacting with other people, are protected in some way from issues of free speech, issues of crime, and so on and so forth. And I think that what's really interesting about this is that this is a sort of step beyond that. This is not just saying we will fine you, which is what they are able to do under these two bits of legislation, but instead this is saying, actually, we will call your executive, your CEO, your founder directly responsible for the incidents that have been caused through your platform. And that is a significant development, because ultimately that then means that you suddenly have not people ending up in jail, but it does mean that Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and others could, in theory, be called partly responsible for the actions that are taken through their platform. And I think that is what is particularly interesting to me. Not that this will cause a huge change or that Mark Zuckerberg or Musk will be quaking in their boots right now, worrying that they're going to be put into shackles when they land in Europe. But I think that it will cause them at the back of their mind to think, well, maybe I'm too big to be caught in this, but perhaps some of my slightly lower down executives won't be. And maybe that will
Chris,
cause a
you
slight
mentioned
change.
related to that, you mentioned a moment ago that interestingly, some of these apps have actually, and Elon Musk has been more cooperative with authorities' requests. Is that a factor, do you think, here in how hard authorities go after some of these apps? Do they look at their degree of cooperation or not, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the reason why we are seeing Pavel Durov arrested right now. It's not because, just only the degree of issue of what is actually on Telegram. It's because of the way in which he's flouted it and kind of shown off that he's flouting it. It's also why we're seeing Elon Musk being targeted so much by European regulators, by the way, and people like Thierry Breton, who is one of the EU's commissioners in charge of looking at how regulation meets the road when it comes to social media platforms. He's picking fights with them as well.
We've got a brief minute here, and I want to ask this question to Ben. We've seen Russia's been, I think, fairly critical of what's happened in France so far, but of course, Durov has had his issues with Russian authorities too. Do you think there's a bit of international power politics going on here?
Well, I think you have to realize or put this in the context of, like, here's a senior Russian businessman who's just been accused of drug trafficking and distributing pornography and has been thrown in jail. And this comes in the context of the prisoner swap that we just had, where Ivan Groshevich was arrested, a US reporter, and put into jail for a year, and eventually swapped in August, and this historic prisoner swap. And so as far as the Duma are concerned, the Russian politicians are already saying the same thing, that the Americans who are behind this, they're building up a prisoner reserve, and they're going to keep our billionaire, and then, look for a swap later on. Again, I don't think, this is classic conspiracy theories that come pouring out at this point. I mean, there's also the fact that Durov was flying from Baku, Azerbaijan, on his way back to St. Petersburg, and he'd been there to try and see Putin, because in Russia, Telegram is actually been under attack. The YouTube slowed down to it's basically not working now. And then just last week, both Telegram and WhatsApp, their services were disrupted. And the belief is that Durov went to Baku to try and see Putin, to lobby him to protect his service so that it wouldn't be shut down. But again, that puts him in proximity of Putin. He's an oligarch in Europe. Every oligarch is being sanctioned and their assets seized. And then suddenly, boom, this Russian tech, the biggest Russian tech billionaire entrepreneur, has just been arrested. And so from Moscow, they see this as completely political.
It's been a really interesting, fabulous discussion. Let's thank our guests very much for it, Ben Aris and Chris Stokel-Walker. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.